Okay, so Rabbi Ari Lamm, thank you for joining us today. You threw out on Twitter, which is the greatest biblical hermeneutical testing ground known to man, because you have to do all your hermeneutics 260 characters at a time or so,
At
unless
least if you're
you,
using it correctly.
yeah, unless you pay money. And you threw out
Well, I
something.
pay the money anyway. I just like how it disciplines you to write concisely.
Oh, okay. It is for the shrewd writer. People like you excel in that space. People like me, I'm like, and another thing, and another thing. But you threw out this challenge on Exter, that Joseph's brothers did not sell him into slavery, which strikes against every impulse who knows everybody who knows the Joseph story. That doesn't sound right. And I wonder if it's not even a Mandela effect. I think it's the Mandela effect where people thought it said something like "Beam me up, Scotty," which actually isn't in any of the TV episodes. But you actually have a stronger argument that the text just doesn't say that, and it doesn't make sense of the text and the movements and the geography and the places that are discussed in the text. So let's lay the scene really quickly. What is going on with Joseph? And maybe you could give us a one sentence why this matters that his brothers didn't sell him.
Yeah. So the way the whole thing started was I was doing a thread on the question of why Joseph never writes home, which we talked about on this podcast. I actually think this was the first place that I talked about it publicly. That ended up developing like a year or two later, no big deal, into a thread. And in a very, very, like really small nutshell, why doesn't Joseph write home? Well, because Joseph, from his perspective, assumes that his father is the one who engineered his exile in the first place. He believes his father sent him away from home. Why? Because Joseph knows the whole history of Genesis, which is that the entire history of Genesis is a story about chosenness and rejection. So the very, very beginning of the creative story, humanity is chosen, the animal kingdom is rejected, represented by the serpent. Couple generations later, Noah has kids, Shem and Japheth are chosen, Ham is rejected, Terah has children, Abraham is chosen, Nahor is rejected. Abraham has children, Isaac is chosen, Ishmael is rejected. Isaac has children, Jacob is chosen, Esau is rejected. Now it gets to Jacob, so Joseph assumes, like all the brothers do, there's going to be a child or children who are rejected.
And this is not just a story. This is his family story. Right?
Yeah,
like
this is
our family history.
Exactly. Like even if all he knows is back to great grandpa Abraham. So this is the story of his family. His whole life would have been shaped by these stories. Moreover, so when Joseph is sent away, he assumes that he's the Esau of the family. How do you know this? Because the Bible, and this we actually didn't talk about on the last podcast. How do we know that he thinks that he's Esau? Because the Bible tells us when Jacob summons Joseph to send him away from home. And again, when Joseph is sent away, all he knows is that he's set upon by his brothers without any explanation. And by the way, the Bible goes out of its way to tell us that the brothers do explain their plan, but when they explain it, Joseph is far away. The Bible tells us Joseph was far away and couldn't hear them.
It's great narrative perspective. Like the camera keeps shifting back and forth between these two different perspectives.
And it's unparalleled. The Bible is the absolute best at this. It hasn't been topped. So it was the GOAT at the time, and it's held up.
Yeah, I think so too.
So Joseph is set upon by his brothers. He assumes his father sent him away. So when his father summons him before him to send him out of the house, Joseph responds with one word. In English, it's translated into 3 words, "Here I am," but in Hebrew, that word is hineni. Hineni is a pretty well-known word in the biblical context, even though it appears very, very few times. It's the word that, prophets will use to respond when God calls them Moses, Samuel, Isaiah. There is actually only one other time in Genesis, and then in addition to that one other time in the entire Bible, where a child responds to a parent with the word hineni. One is Joseph. The other, earlier in Genesis, is when Isaac summons Esau before him to send him out of the house, and Esau responds hineni. And it's the only other time. Esau then leaves the house. What happens while he's gone? From his perspective, Jacob, his younger brother, is then chosen over Esau, and Esau is rejected, and that's what happens. So Joseph just assumes that he's Esau. So why doesn't he write home? Because he assumes he's been rejected. He doesn't see this as like a temporary exile that he'll one day return from. He's gone, just like Esau was gone.
Yeah,
like Ishmael was gone.
Patriarching, as they say today.
Yeah, exactly. So when the brothers come, all Joseph is trying to do, he's not trying to get back to his old life. He knows that life is gone. What he does, and the Bible tells us, the Bible says, and he remembers his dreams that he dreamed. The only thing Joseph has left to him in his life is dream interpretation. And it's the thing that made his career, now that he's been thrown out of his father's house, what made his life was his dream interpretation. The only dreams he ever had that he couldn't successfully interpret were, or as he sees it, were his own dreams. And so now that his brothers are here and he remembers those dreams he had of them coming and bowing to him, he sets about trying to fulfill that one last dream, right? It's like one last heist and then I'm out. And so and what seems to be part of this is so the first thing he needs to do is get Benjamin down there to fulfill the rest of the dream.
So when you say he wants to fulfill this dream, you mean he's manufacturing a circumstance. So all of this playing and messing with his brothers and sending them back and forth and charging them with capital crimes, this is actually orchestrating an event whereby this dream is going to come to its fulfillment, and he also gets his brother back in the process.
Now, one other element which I've toyed around with, I don't know if I'm 100% convinced by it yet, but I actually am probably more than 50%. So I'll throw it out there for what it's worth. I actually think an additional element to this is that Joseph is trying to engineer Benjamin staying with him, which clearly is what he's trying to do right before Judah confronts him, and begs for him to be substituted for Benjamin. Why? Because Joseph, I think, thinks that the children of Rachel have been rejected.
Right. To be clear, Joseph and
Benjamin are
the only two.
Are full siblings.
Full 100% blood siblings. Yep.
Right. So what Judah reveals inadvertently in his plea for Benjamin's life is he says, I have to bring him back because my father, had actually two sons who were taken from him. There's Benjamin, but there was the first one that is Einenu, which in Hebrew means he is gone. And he says to Joseph, Avdecha Amar, your servant, referring to his father, said, I had two children, V'achad tarof taraf, one was eaten by wild animals, and I haven't seen him since, and I don't know what happened to him. And in that moment, that's the last thing Judah says to Joseph before he reveals himself. And Joseph in that moment realizes this whole time his father loved him, never sent him away. And the whole thing was completely misunderstood in his mind. He realizes in that moment his father loved him this whole time. And it's in that moment that he can't hold back. And this is another point we didn't make in the last pod. What's the question that Joseph asked? The first thing he asks when he hears this. The Bible tells us he could no longer hold back his tears. He says, "Is my father still alive?"
Yep.
A lot of the medieval and early modern commentators point out it's a nonsensical question. I mean, the whole premise of Judah's point is that his father's still alive. But I think the answer is, it's actually not a logical question. It's an emotional question. It's the question of the most powerful man on earth who, for all of his power, is still a little boy who was rejected by his father, who felt rejected by his father. And in this moment, he's realizing his father was really there for him. It's just a moment of unparalleled pathos. So what came out of that was the question of, well, okay, Joseph, in that moment, when he reveals himself to his brothers, says, I'm just going to pull it up.
Yeah, and when you say it in Hebrew, slow it down a little bit. So
Sure, of course.
Those of us who struggle with our audio Hebrew.
I got you.
Yeah.
So we're in Genesis 45. And what Joseph says to them is in verse 4. Right? Then Joseph said to his brothers, "Come closer to me," and they came closer. He said, "I am your brother Joseph, whom you sold into Egypt." Right? In Hebrew, it's Asher Mechartem Osi Mitzrayma. You sold me into Egypt. And then he says, "Now do not be distressed or angry with yourselves because you sold me here." Right? And again, he uses that same language. Ki Mechartem Osi, because you sold me. For God sent me before you to preserve life. Now, I noticed that because I was, one of the things I love to do is when you're analyzing the Hebrew Bible. So I think one thing people often don't get about it is that because at least the people who are in my audience and that I typically speak to on a regular basis are English speakers, and English is a massive language. It's a huge vocabulary, and not only does it have a huge vocabulary like natively, but it's actually organically. It's actually built from a couple of different languages, right? So, George Orwell famously objected to the use of words with French etymology because you should just use good Anglo-Saxon words and they're shorter and they're stronger and whatever. But for every word in the English language, there's probably of Anglo-Saxon etymology, there's probably another word with Norman French etymology. And frankly, there are a bunch of versions of all of those different ones. So the way to use, because it's a huge vocabulary, a marker of good style is to use a bunch of different words for the same thing.
Mm-hmm. Oh, this is a great way to put this point.
Right. Whereas in biblical Hebrew, which is a tiny lexicon, the biblical Hebrew is such a small vocabulary that the classical, late antique Hebrew poets who were absolute masters, one of the first things they had to do was just invent a whole bunch of words.
Right. A lot of metaphors get used. Yeah.
Or even just words that never existed in Hebrew before. They had to invent them to enlarge the vocabulary. But biblical Hebrew is a tiny vocabulary. So whereas in English you use a lot of different words for the same thing, in biblical Hebrew you use a lot of the same words for different things. And part of the way that Hebrew and the Bible makes meaning is by drawing your attention. Instead of using lots of different words, it uses lots of different narratives and stories. And it hyperlinks them together so that the Bible can kind of tell you one story, but beneath that story or connected to that story are 3 or 4 different other stories that the Bible wants you to read alongside those so that you can get the full picture of what the whole story means emotionally, spiritually, literarily, artistically, etc. So when I saw that word that Joseph repeats, and typically, one of the, there's always an annoying German word for all these literary concepts. So this one is Leitwort, right? Which is when you see an uncommon word or a relatively uncommon word repeated a bunch of times in a single biblical narrative, it's usually there for a reason, and it tells you something about the narrative. So in this case, that word, that root Machar, which means to sell, is repeated twice, in 2 sentences. Now, you would expect it. But at the same time, I was like, okay, where is that connecting back to? Will that help us at all? And what I noticed is that once you look back to where Joseph is sold, one thing becomes abundantly clear, which is that the text never, ever says that the brothers sold Joseph. It says that Joseph was sold, but not by it explicitly says it was not by the brothers. And
there's an ambiguity in the text that I think we should just point out. When you read it in English, it's not exactly clear that it's an ambiguity. I think some English translations try to flag it up a little bit by the way they phrase the pronouns there. Before we go any further, what's the one sentence, for people who are like, why we're digging pretty deep in the minutia of Hebrew grammar and vocab, why does it matter that the brothers did or didn't sell just for the storyline of Genesis and Exodus?
Yeah. So what happens here, as far as I'm concerned, by the way, I'd love to hear your perspective on it too, but why is this important? So on the one hand, the argument that I would make is that the brothers absolutely fully intended to sell Joseph, but they don't successfully do it.
Right. They get beat to the punch.
Right. And by the time they get there, and really by the time Reuben gets there, Reuben's the one who discovers what has happened. And it's not, the verses aren't usually read that way, because if you assume the brothers sold Joseph, then by the time Reuben gets there, the brothers have already sold him. So people don't realize that Reuben's the one who discovers it, and then it makes it impossible to read those verses. We'll get to that in a second. Yeah. The point is, the brothers actually have no idea what happened to Joseph. So first of all, that's why they're not expecting to see him in Egypt when they see, because as far as they know, they have no idea. Either he was maybe someone took him, maybe he was kidnapped. Frankly, maybe he was killed. They have no idea what happened to him. So when they go back to their father and lie to him, which they do by telling him he was eaten by a wild animal, they're actually in some ways in the same boat as Jacob. They don't know what happened to Joseph. And what comes together from this is that the brothers in the traditional telling the story are like sociopaths, or they seem like sociopaths. These are people who drag their brother up. Yes, they threw him in a pit and all this, but now they're dragging him up and they're selling him to slavers. And again,
kind of like why kill him when we can make money off this guy?
Yeah, exactly. And
which is not true.
Right. It's not an inaccurate argument.
Right.
And moreover, one of the things we know from the ancient world, we have texts from outside the Bible that talk about it. Biblical slavery in Egypt in the Bronze Age was a fate worse than death. And it was a horrible, horrible fate. So for them to sell him into this it's one thing to talk about it, the thing to actually do it. Some of the great artistic works, artistic masterpieces of the Renaissance period, the Baroque period, depict this moment when Joseph is sold. And it's always heart-wrenching. But what this actually tells us, the brothers actually come off more as like bumbling. They have not yet come into their own as men, as people, as upstanding citizens. And part of the journey they have to go on, in parallel with Joseph, is a journey of maturity and growth. And what you can see happens to all of them over the course, like once you read it this way, you see they have this like harebrained, to borrow a Yiddish phrase, half tuchus, like half-baked plan to get rid of Joseph. It's spur of the moment. They have no idea what they're doing. And meanwhile, Joseph is this snot-nosed little brat from their perspective.
Because the plan comes together as they see him on the horizon, right?
Yeah. So and they say, here comes this master of dreams. Let's see what happens to his dreams now.
We got 15 minutes max to hatch this plan.
Yeah. And by the way, the rabbinic hermeneutical tradition plays this up by saying Joseph is described in the early verses of chapter 37 in Genesis as a youth. And rabbinic literature goes ham on that. Yeah, he was playing with his hair and putting on makeup, and he was just like a brat, right? He was like a huge brat. And it's in this moment that both of them separate. The brothers go this way and Joseph goes that way. And then what you get to see play out over the next couple of chapters is you see all the main players go on their own journey of maturity. Sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. So for example, the very next thing that happens is not, and then here's what happened to Joseph in Egypt. The very next thing we're told after they sell Joseph is here's what happens to Judah. Judah goes on this whole journey of maturing journey with Tamar.
Can we just say the weirdest journey of maturity one could possibly imagine?
Yeah, exactly.
He comes to realize what true righteousness looks like. That's how they would, in a world. That would be the movie trailer version.
Exactly. I mean, like, honestly, that you could play chapter 38 to the tune of Lola, and like it would sync up like Floyd's Dark Side of the Moon and The Wizard of Oz, So in any event, what happens is Judah goes on this transformational journey where his values are put to the test and where his integrity is put to the test, and he passes and becomes a hero. Reuben, in turn, never really recovers from this failure of leadership, and in fact, when it comes time to figure out how to protect Benjamin when they bring him down to Egypt at the Grand Vizier's request, whom they don't realize is Joseph, Reuben is all over the place. And ultimately doesn't earn the trust of Jacob. And as a consequence, Judah, really consciously or not, usurps his place as the leader of the brothers. And then meanwhile, Joseph, of course, has to go on his own journey of growth. And what this sets up, because in so many ways Genesis just sets up what's going to happen in all the subsequent books. Like oftentimes, by the way, like a very common DM I get is like, I love this. Why I read the Bible? If I want to start reading the Bible again, like where should I start? I'm always like, Genesis is a great place to start.
I mean, the name says it all.
Yeah. But I truly believe like if you understand Genesis, you're set up to understand the rest of it. If you don't, you're going to struggle with everything else. What happens over the course of the next couple books is the tribes themselves have to go on this journey. So just to give one example, take the two most antagonistic archetypes from within the tribes, Simeon and Levi. Simeon and Levi are the ones who sack and slaughter the people of Shechem, and which is also, it's another fascinating passage in Genesis where that's the story of the rape of Dinah, where Shechem kidnaps Dinah, rapes her, and by the way, the Bible knows how to describe rape. It has very specific Hebrew vocabulary for that, which it uses there. And Simeon and Levi then, in order to both get her back and avenge her, slaughter the whole town of Shechem, which aided and abetted this crime, and said nothing as its chieftain just engaged in horrific behavior. Jacob is very upset at Simeon and Levi, and the argument that he makes to them for why what they did was wrong is not on grounds that what they did was wrong,
right?
But that it puts him in danger.
Yeah,
which is also true.
Yeah, you made us a stink, right? Like
you're
drawing heat rather than light.
Exactly. And the Bible in that chapter Genesis gives Simeon and Levi the final word, and they say, like, what you're basically treating your own daughter like a harlot, and look what you're exposing her to, and look at the danger you've put her in. Like, how could that possibly be just? But then at the end of Genesis, we always call it Jacob's blessings, but it's a mixed bag, right? Like Jacob blesses most of his children,
right?
But Reuben gets it pretty bad, and Simeon and Levi get torched.
Savage.
His final words to them are, Simeon and Levi are brothers. Weapons of violence are your stock and trade, and he basically curses them. Now, why is that important? And by the way, the rabbis have a tradition, which I think which is textually rooted, and it might even be the simple reading, which is that there are two brothers who make the suggestion that they should kill Joseph before Reuben objects, and then Judah objects. The rabbis identified those two brothers, who are unnamed in Genesis, as Simeon and Levi. There's textual support for it, because they're described as Ish El Achiv, a man speaking to his brother. Later on, the only two tribes that Jacob refers to as brothers are Simeon and Levi. And if you assume that we know Reuben wasn't making that suggestion, we know Judah wasn't making that suggestion.
The only two brothers of Leah left, right?
Yeah, it's just Simeon and Levi. So it probably actually was Simeon and Levi. So these are two brothers who have a violent streak. And not only violent tendencies, but have used violence and
to solve what they perceive as problems.
That's right.
Okay.
As problems, as threats to their family. And what's interesting to see is that story actually plays out then over the course of Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. For example, at the sin of the golden calf.
I was going to say,
Moses.
32,
Yeah, Moses says, after he sees what Aaron has done, he says, those who are for God come to me, and says, these people the perpetrators of this atrocity have to be put to death. Whom does he summon? The tribe of Levi.
Levi, yeah.
Whereas later in Numbers, when Israelites are shacking up, literally and figuratively, with the Midianites, the tribe that essentially leads that rebellion against God and Moses is the tribe of Simeon.
Yeah.
And so you can kind of see Levi and Simeon kind of take these two paths. And by the way, arguably, by the time the Israelites make it into the land, Simeon, in a way, has almost disappeared.
Yeah.
His tribal allotment, if you look at the territorial boundaries, is actually within Judah's territorial boundaries. It doesn't seem to have his own territory. So the tribe of Simeon, it almost fades away, as you said. And so why is it so interesting to think about who sells Joseph? It's because this whole, do the brothers actually do it or not? It's because Genesis is actually laying the seeds of what's going to happen to the tribes of Israel as they move forward, and what's going to happen to the people of Israel and through them to the rest of humanity. And what you can see in this moment is that there's this, as opposed to understanding the sale of Joseph as this original sin that they now have to atone for, it becomes this potential sin that they actually don't go through with by what an outside, what a secular observer might call happenstance, what I would call, what we would call divine guidance and God's hand of protection over all of this. They're almost saved from going through with this. And then the question is, now that they've been given this reprieve, this moral, spiritual reprieve, what do they do with it?
Hey there, if you've benefited from this content at all, please hit the like and subscribe, or subscribe and like, one of those or both of them together on this video. It helps us tremendously with the math algorithm nerd monsters. Yeah. If I could jump to the because we're going to get back to the actual passage of whether they sold or not, or what happened there in the pit. But I think the obvious place when I heard it, my first thought was, but they themselves say, like when Joseph starts bringing the hammer down, they don't know it's Joseph. They just know this Egyptian lord is bringing the hammer down on them. their first response is, this is because of what we did to our brother Joseph, right?
Yeah.
And I guess the question we're answering here is, well, what is the this in that state? I don't know if it's hazeh or what's used in that sentence, but what is the this that we did to our brothers?
Mm-hmm.
And in a very similar sense to in Eden, it's because you have done this, and you're like, what? Could you say more about the this here? What is
Yeah,
what
yeah.
was the this that the serpent has done, right? Okay.
Yep. So if that was actually one of the verses that set me off on this, because if you were gonna see the brothers talking about the sale, that's where you'd see it, right? Because the Bible actually goes out of its way to tell us that. Well, by the way, let's back up a second. Why does the Bible tell us what the brothers said to themselves about what they did to Joseph? Because the Bible is actually setting up what will become a key plot point when Joseph reveals himself, which is that Joseph's entire decision to reveal himself to his brothers turns on him hearing something the brothers said without them realizing that he's Joseph. The ultimate reveal comes about because Judah, again, inadvertently reveals to this man whom he doesn't realize is Joseph that actually Joseph's father never knew what happened to him. The way the Bible sets that up is by telling us that when the brothers were around Joseph, they would actually speak their native tongue. They would speak Hebrew to each other, and just assume that when they did that, it's kind of like Frank Costanza going into the Korean nail salon and hearing them talk about him. They just assume he doesn't speak Korean, right? So they assume that Joseph doesn't understand them, but he does. And what's the first thing? How does the Bible set that up? The Bible sets that up by saying that the brothers said to themselves in Hebrew, each man said to his brother, right? They said to one another, "Behischanano elenu v'lo shamanu, akain ba'a elenu hatzara hazos," which means, if I can change it, we are guilty on account of our brother, for we saw the pain of his, the pain of his soul or his body in pain when he pled before us, and we didn't listen to him. Therefore, all of this trouble has come upon us. Now, if you actually think about what that verse does and doesn't say, what it says is, we saw his anguish when he pleaded with us. Okay. So most people interpret that as referring to, well, when did they see him plead? Well, it must be that he pled when they were selling him. We don't know that. The text doesn't say that. In fact, the text, as we'll see when we read that passage, is pretty short. The text very, very specifically does not say that the brothers were there when he was sold. In fact, and it's not like it leaves it to our imagination. The text tells us who sold him, and it wasn't the brothers.
Right.
And even in that case, the text does not say anything about Joseph pleading to them. So when is it much more likely that he begged, that he pled before them, they didn't listen? Well, it's when we know that they were there and Joseph was there, when they attack him. The Bible tells us they attacked him and they stripped his coat and then they took him and they threw him in a pit. That's when he would have pled, because they were literally attacking him. He thought that he probably thought they were going to kill him. And we didn't listen and we threw him in a pit. So that's all the brothers say. They don't say, this is what we get for selling him, because they don't know what happened to him.
Right. And the pleading too, also, I think a point that you bring up is, and this is the part I had never actually thought about, is the idea that they were just planning on leaving him in a pit to die, right? That it would only take a few days, presumably.
Yeah.
And the text is very specific. It's nomaim in the pit, right?
So by the way, so there's actually this is one of those famous rabbinic interpretations that like every kid my age, grew up with, and that my kids are growing up with. My daughter is studying for chapter 37 for her upcoming Bible test. So we were just studying this chapter in Hebrew. The verse says, "V'habor reik ein bo mayim," and the pit was empty; it had no water in it. So the rabbis say, well, they're very attentive to those kind of like double expressions as well. If the pit was empty, of course it didn't have water in it. Why does it tell us that? Well, the answer is because it did have something in it: nechashim v'akrabim, snakes and scorpions.
Oh.
So growing up, we're all like, we all knew that they threw him into this like Indiana Jones style snake pit, right? And then Joseph, like on his way out, just like grabs his hat, But the point is, why do the rabbis do this? Not just for no reason. What they're trying to identify deliberately is that this was a place where they thought Joseph would die. He would either die from exposure or he would die from getting killed by a wild animal, which is exactly what they say happened to him once they realized that he's gone, right? Because that's what they assumed would happen to him.
It could be one of those statements like it actually is true. You know, like your eyes will be open and you'll be like God, knowing good and evil. It actually is true according to the text.
Yeah.
Or throw the boys into the Nile River. Well, she does throw Moses in the Nile River. She just surrounds with a basket, right?
Yeah, right. Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly.
Yeah. Good. Okay. So let's get into that text itself, and because you've been making these really grandiose claims, and I'm sure some people are going, I don't remember the story that way,
which I should now probably try and substantiate. Okay.
Yeah.
So.
This is Genesis 37.
Genesis 37. So we'll start with Genesis 37, verse 23. So if you have your Bible in front of you, you could open it up. Pause and open. All right, now we're back.
We're back.
I'm just taking breaks on your podcast, right? So,
it's Elaine. Hey.
It's just not good podcast etiquette. But okay, in any event. So what happens is actually backing up a little bit, if you go back up to verse 19, so Joseph is coming close. They said to one another, here comes this dreamer. And verse 20, come now, let us kill him and throw him into one of the pits. Then we shall say that a wild animal has devoured him, and we shall see what will become of his dreams. Right? But when Reuben heard it, he delivered him out of their hands, saying, let us not take his life. Reuben said to them, shed no blood, throw him into this pit here in the wilderness, but lay no hand on him. Why did he do this? So that he might rescue him out of their hand and restore him to his father. Okay, so this establishes two things. One, the brothers at first intended to kill him, but what did they think would accomplish that? Throwing him in the pit. They assumed that throwing him in the pit would kill him. I mean, listen, again, it could be that they assumed that they figured they would kill him first and then dump his body in the pit. But nevertheless, they did not expect him to emerge from this circumstance alive. The second thing that this establishes for us is that Reuben does not want to kill him. And in fact, Reuben wants to save him. Now, he doesn't have the gumption, the charisma, the leadership, the spine to stand up and demand that the brothers leave Joseph alone. And that's, part of Reuben's journey.
Right.
But nevertheless, Reuben wants to save him. And his plan, which he begins to lay out here, is that he figured, we'll throw him in the pit alive, right? We'll throw him in the pit alive. And sure, my brothers assume that he'll die there. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to circle back around when they're not looking, and I'm going to go find him. Why is that important? Because what it establishes for us is that Reuben's plan is to get to the pit after he's dumped there before the brothers do. And his assumption is that the brothers won't see him doing that.
Yeah, which means the pit, which is, sorry, this is where you're probably going. The pit, they're not right next to
go ahead.
They're not barbecuing right next to the pit, listening to him pleading or something. Yeah.
Correct. Which means that they're not near the pit after they throw him in it. Which, and there's the argument doesn't depend on this, but it is interesting if you go to the Holy Land and you look at the geography of where this happens around the area of Dothan, which is where the brothers are shepherding their sheep, you can see the geography like right away. They're basically eating in the hill, like at the tip of the hill country. Mm-hmm. 5 kilometers away is the wilderness where they dump him in a pit. So they're about, give or take like 2-ish miles, 2 to 4 miles from where they dump him. Okay. Then it says, and they took him and threw him into a pit. And then, as you said, the pit was empty. There was no water in it, right? So they dump him in a place where they assume, all, including Reuben, that if he's left there, he'll die. Then the verse says, then they sat down to eat, and looking up, they saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead, with their camels carrying gum, balm, and resin on their way to carry it down to Egypt. Okay, now this is important for a couple reasons. Number one, it tells us that they sat down to eat. It doesn't tell us where, but as we just said, it must be somewhere where the pit is not visible, because that's Reuben's whole plan. And it's not like they were planning to go home for the night. As we know from Jacob's entire mission to Joseph, this was an extended leave. So they're planning to stay, just not right near the pit. Number one. Number two, the fact that they could see a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead, from far off, must mean that they have some vantage point, that they're standing on the high ground, right? That they can see a caravan coming from far off. again, once you're in the place, you can see exactly where they were standing, and you actually can see the ancient trade route that comes from the north and goes all the way down. There are two different trade routes. That one goes down the coast to Egypt. That's probably the route that it was. Yeah. But again, you don't need this. You don't need to see it for the argument to work. But it does make it a lot more vivid. It's pretty cool.
Even visualizing it, the language here that they look up. That's the language of raising their eyes. Staring off into the far distance and seeing something.
Right. That's correct. So right. So for example, the language that is used there in the Hebrew is vayis'u einehem vayiru, and they lift up their eyes and they see, right? So they're looking off into the distance. Which is a very common phrase, or it's a unique phrase used in very specific locations across the Torah. That's right. Okay, then what happens? Then Judah said to his brothers, "What profit is it if we kill our brother and conceal his blood? Come, let us sell him to the Ishmaelites and not lay our hands on him, for he is our brother, our own flesh." And his brothers agreed. Okay, so Judah now sets out the plan. You know what? Let's not kill him. Now, by the way, let's not kill him. Let's sell him instead. This establishes two things. Number one, the brothers assumed, again, Judah confirms it here again. They assumed that by throwing him in the pit, that would kill him. Right? Because it's not like they're planning to go back and cut his throat, right? They assume that what they've done will kill him, right? Not immediately, but he'll die from this. Instead of leaving him there, we are going to go sell him. The second thing this establishes is precisely that. The brothers intended to sell him to the Ishmaelites that they saw coming. Okay. Then the next verse says in Hebrew, and some Midianite merchants came, merchant men came by, and then it says, and they pulled him up and they brought him up from the pit, and they sold Joseph to the Ishmaelites. Now, if you read that verse straight up, it seems very clear that the people who sold him to the Ishmaelites were the Midianites. So again, just the way that translates, when some Midianite traders passed by, they drew Joseph up, lifting him out of the pit, and sold him to the Ishmaelites for 20 pieces of silver. And then they took Joseph to Egypt. Now,
so you have to imagine, I guess, looking out on the landscape here, where the pit is. They raise their eyes, they see a caravan coming.
Yep.
And then they're like, oh, okay, there's a caravan heading by there.
By the time they get down.
Yeah, and then
we'll get Joseph.
Now there's another group of people, the Midianites, which would be in this region as well, right?
That's right.
Natural to this region, come by and lift him out of the pit. And that's when when Reuben finally goes back, this is when we have the crap moment.
So right. So what happens is, they're Midianites who are already at the pit, which the brothers cannot see. And again, we've established the whole point of this, the whole point of Reuben's stratagem is that none of the brothers can see the pit. And so, of course, they have no idea what's happening at the pit at that moment. It's one of these things where it's like, as they're planning to sell him, someone else already has that same bright idea, and they're at the pit, the Midianites. So the Midianites pick him up, and then the assumption is they're traveling in the opposite direction from the Ishmaelites. They meet up with the Ishmaelites, and they sell Joseph for 20 pieces of silver.
Yeah.
Now,
this is like finding $20 on the ground.
Yeah, exactly. And then what happens? Very, very next verse tells us, when Reuben returned to the pit, because remember, Reuben believes, now that Reuben knows that the brother's going to come get him and sell him, Reuben's like, the time to act is now. So he runs ahead of the brothers to the pit. When Reuben returned to the pit and saw that Joseph was not in the pit, he tore his clothes. He returned to his brothers, and that verse says, Yashov el echav vayomar, and he returned to his brothers and he said, the child is no more. He doesn't say the child was killed. He doesn't say the child was sold. He says he's no more, because he doesn't know what happened to him. That very same word, is no more, is the same word that Genesis uses to refer to Enoch, for example. What happened to him? God took him. We have no idea what happened, right? Aniva, and as for myself, where will I go? He's like, I'm dead. I'm dead meat. What am I going to do? So then the very next verse says, right, so he returned to his brothers and said, the boy is gone, and where can I turn? Then they took Joseph's robe, slaughtered a goat, and dipped the robe in the blood. They had the ornamented robe taken to their father, right, or the coat of many colors, or the woolen tunic, whatever it means, taken to their father, and they said, or the linen tunic taken to their father, and they said, this we have found, see now whether it is your son's robe or not. He recognized it and said, it's my son's robe, and then the story goes from there.
Yeah. And which is all kinds of fun parallels going on here in Judah and Tamar, right?
Yes.
Phrase is, whose do these belong, right?
Yeah, or recognize now, right? To whom these belong, hakerna, right? So recognize these. So yes, this is a crucial moment, excuse me, in the life of Judah. And what you can see here is, again, now, if you assume the brothers sold Joseph, then the whole thing makes no sense. First of all, where do the Midianites come from and what are they doing there? So one theory I grew up with, for example, and it's a good faith attempt to make sense of the text as well. The text says, in verse 28, "Vayavru anashim midjanim socharim vayimshechu vayalu et Yosef min habor," which translates as, and some Midianite merchant men passed by and they drew him up and they lifted up Joseph from the pit. Vayim karut Yosef, layishmelim, and they sold him to the. But technically, what the verse says is, and Midianite merchant men passed by. Then when it says Vayim shechu vayalu and vayalu at Yosef min habor, and they drew up and they lifted up Joseph from the pit. So the simple way to read that, and really the correct way to read that, is it was the Midianites who did that. That's standard biblical Hebrew. But technically, what that means is, and the Midianites passed by, and they drew him up and lifted him up from the pit. So the they could be somebody else, maybe, right? Again, it reads very infelicitously, but maybe the Midianites came along and they lifted him up out of the pit for the brothers, and then they gave him to the brothers, and the brothers were the ones who sold him, right?
Thanks for doing us the solid.
Exactly. Right. So you have to figure out, and then by the way, by the time Joseph gets down to Egypt, if you look, I believe in chapter 39, in this chapter, at the very end of the chapter, in verse 36, it says, "V'hamidanim macharu oto el Mitzrayim asar tabachim." Meanwhile, the way that the midanim is the word midanim is translated here is the Midianites had sold him in Egypt to Potiphar. That's not what the text says. The text says Midanim, the Medanites. Now, we don't know who the Medanites are, but the Midianites seem to have been going in the other direction. The point is, it actually probably wasn't the Midianites. It actually is this random group of people. What is the text trying to tell us? Joseph changed hands multiple times by the time he got down to Egypt. So even if the brothers managed to somehow hear a rumor that Joseph had gotten sold, what they would have heard is that he was taken up by Midianites who were going to the north. Then the Ishmaelites were going to the south. And then he changed it. The point is, the Bible is trying to communicate to us that there was no possible way for the brothers or Jacob or anybody else to find Joseph. That's the point. Why? Because the whole rest of the narrative depends on them having no idea that their brother could possibly have ended up in Egypt. So that's
being not just that, being fairly convinced that he's dead.
That he's dead.
I mean, he's got to be dead for the rest of it to work. Yeah,
exactly. Now, by the way, in addition to that, even if you can somehow figure out maybe the ones who sold him, it refers to they, and even though it doesn't mention the brothers, maybe they is the brothers. But even more than that, if you assume that the brothers were the ones who sold Joseph, then verse 29 makes very little sense. Because it says, when Reuben returned to the pit and saw that Joseph was not in the pit, he tore his clothes, returned to his brothers, and said, "The boy is gone, and where can I turn?" Then they took Joseph's robe, right? If the brothers already sold him, then Reuben's not giving them new news. So why is Reuben freaking out? He could just ask the brothers what happened to him. The way the verse reports it makes it sound like Reuben is giving them brand new news, number one. Number two, if Reuben's whole plan was to get Joseph before the other brothers could get him, he failed, right? Meaning his only move was to return to the pit and get there before the brothers and save him, and he clearly wasn't able to do that. Why not? There's like an ancient rabbinic tradition which actually points out this difficulty, and it solves it, or I would say it actually points out how it's unresolved by noting that the word that it uses for what Reuben does is vayashov Reuven el habor, and Reuben returned to the pit. That word for return, shuv, can mean two things. It can mean to return, and it can also mean what we would say in English is repent. So there are two options that are laid out for where Reuben was. Well, maybe Reuben went home. Maybe all the brothers were taking turns going home to take care of dad, and this was Reuben's turn. So Reuben left. While Reuben was gone, the brother, and it always intended to come back and save Joseph. While he was gone, the brothers sell him, and by the time he gets back, he's surprised to find where they go. Again, it's a very difficult answer, but it does point out the difficulty. The other option, which I think is also very clever, is it takes note of that root shuv, which can mean repent, and says that Reuben. Why did Reuben specifically have to constantly go back to help his dad? Well, because Reuben had messed with his dad.
he got his own commandment about sexuality in Leviticus 18, right?
That's right. That's right. That's right. That's right.
Can't have sex with your mom or your stepmom.
Yeah. Right, exactly. So the rabbis actually have a tradition where they insist that Reuben could not possibly have done something that terrible, so it must have been something else. But the simple reading of the text is that Reuben messed with his mother-in-law, or rather with his stepmom. But yeah, like, or stepmom, or your. Have I made myself clear?
Yeah, Reuben.
Yeah, exactly. Not singling anyone out.
Yeah.
But
I
you know.
Think this,
yeah.
Sorry.
No, but the idea is that Reuben was going back and doing repentance. And
But
anyway, the whole, why do the rabbis point this out? Because they're pointing out, if the brothers already sold Joseph, then Reuben's role in this story makes no sense.
Right. And I think what I really appreciate about what you're doing, which is really you're distilling a lot of rabbinic tradition and rabbinic ways of looking at the text. But when we say, well, what does that mean? I think for me, what it means is you're paying attention to every single word in the text and why it's there, and that there was a construction on purpose, and things like the character development that you've been laying out about tribes, the nation itself, down to individuals. This is very sophisticated storytelling, and it's not telenovela just for the sake of, titillating the ear and making everybody kind of have something to lean in around the fire. But it's actually teaching us about family dynamics, many of which modern Americans understand, right? These kinds of dysfunctional family dynamics. So it is very helpful. So what do we do? I know you have to go. Really quick plug. What do we do for those who might not read or speak Hebrew?
Oh my God.
Yeah.
So
where do we go from here now that...
First of all, follow me on X at Rabbi Lamm.
Yeah. We have great threads on reading the Bible in Hebrew.
Totally do that. Please God, relaunching my podcast shortly, and then hopefully coming out with a book. Stay tuned for that. Called Good Faith Effort. So there's a nice back catalog. Totally check that out. I actually have been thinking about this. This is, I haven't said this out loud yet, so this may be a terrible idea.
All right.
I've actually been playing around with here's the thing. Hebrew is actually biblical Hebrew is not a difficult language to learn, but it is a difficult language to, as I have found, to teach well. Not because there's anything about the language that makes it difficult to teach, but rather because there are so many bad options of teaching aids and textbooks. And if you've bought a Hebrew language textbook, you've already gone wrong. Don't ask me which one is good. You've already made it 100 times harder on yourself, right? So I actually had this experience, and shout out to Zena Hitz, also a great follow on Twitter, the professor at I want to say St. John's College, but she's the founder of the Caravan Project, which is a wonderful online education initiative. You could learn anything you want basically for free. They'll set you up with a class. She actually asked me to teach Hebrew, biblical Hebrew, to a couple people who wanted it or who were all amazing. When we started, literally no one could even recognize a letter of the Hebrew alphabet. And people had different backgrounds, scientist, professor, retiree, etc. No one knew anything. And within 8 months, they were reading Genesis 22 independently. I gave them a little help. And actually, even after we stopped reading together, we did, I believe we did an hour a week, twice a week, and gave them a little bit of homework, but not much. They've actually continued to read. They're going to be finishing Genesis soon. They've continued to read without me. It's amazing. You actually can do it really quickly. We started by using the academic textbooks and just pretty quickly realized that they were making it boring and hard and bad. And I actually switched to my kids go to a yeshiva day school, so an Orthodox Jewish school, and they start learning Hebrew. I mean, they start learning the alphabet, etc. when they're in kindergarten. But I believe second grade is when the Bible curriculum really takes off. And so they have this amazing curriculum that's designed for second graders, but it's effectively designed for beginners. And it teaches you Hebrew in a much more fun, effective, and normal way. And we actually switched to the second grade Orthodox Jewish biblical Hebrew curriculum, and then we flew.
Yeah.
So it's called Lahavin.
Natural language learning.
It's so good. You probably need a guide to go through it, but I was thinking of experimenting, and this is what I haven't mentioned this before, but I was thinking of experimenting with doing Hebrew classes on X Spaces and just giving them periodically. So I hope to do that. So stay tuned if that happens. Thumbs aloft.
That sounds great. There are some. I don't know if you know Aleph with Beth.
I haven't, but that sounds awesome.
They do videos in the same way.
It's a cool name.
Videos are only in Hebrew, but it's like you're a child. They start with dolls and like men, women.
That's the only way to learn.
Yeah. And I feel in some ways, I've said this many times on this podcast, somewhat crippled by the way I learned Hebrew in a seminary. And God bless them. There are people that works for them, but I think for most of us, it just does not. Yeah. All right, Ari Lamm, they can find you on X giving ripping threads on the Hebrew Bible and why it's so important to at least understand what's going on in the Hebrew. Thank you so much for your time and guiding us through the story today.
Totally. Thanks so much for having me. This is one of my favorite podcasts, so shouts to the listeners.